Thank you all for coming. I'm Alicia, teach 4th grade in Oswego.
I'm Jenna Riordan, and I teach 4th grade in Quincy, Illinois.
So what we're going to do first is kind of like a think, pair, share, but you are all going to stand up, raise your hand, raise your hand, stand up.
Good job, Kyle.
So we're going to practice this. So I was like, oh, da-da-da-da-da, oh, let's be partners, and then we high five, and then there will be a question on the screen, and then that's your partner. So just because you're sitting at the same table, doesn't mean that's your partner. You kind of walk around, and then whoever, you kind of like make eye contact, and then high five, and then, yeah. And so everyone stand up, raise your hand, mingle.
Nice job.
Nice job. Okay,
Nice.
Perfect.
Great.
Now that we have our partners, so you are going to assess what does it look like to gather data. And you will have 1 minute. Go.
I'll just start. I'm math, so I've got a couple ideas.
Okay.
So.
Go for us.
Well, for like data, I mean, well, specifically for like education, you take like like assessments, stuff like that.
Evaluations,
Do anything that like, not like necessarily like, like formal assessments, but like engage and like underlying like hard things.
I know, right? Like evaluate the student scores compared to each other.
Yeah. Good for like selecting record book, surveys.
3, 2, 1. All right. Please get back to where you were seated. Does anyone want to volunteer to start sharing first? All right, then we're just going to take. This table can go first. What were you and your partner talking about?
We just said like comparing students' test scores together, and then by forming a Google Doc and putting all the information in.
So we said pre-test, post-test, maybe a lot of observations and group work, SLOs and charts and graphs.
Can you clarify what an SLO is?
Yeah, an SLO is student learning outcomes or objectives, I can never remember, and it's basically all of your numbers and predictions, so how they did on their pre-test, prediction of how they're going to do on their post-test, and then their post-test, and do they need it on. Fun stuff.
Next thing we want to share out.
We said that like it takes place over time, and that like you gather it and you like keep it in like one spot. So like I'm student teaching right now, and my co-op just has a whole student information binder that is recording.
Yeah.
Evidence, just clinical evidence of student work and their progress monitoring.
Good. Okay, so now each table is going to get a scenario, and your job is to read your scenario, and then you have to figure out what type of data you might use to solve the problem. Questions? Okay.
Kind of like how you would use it to modify instruction. We'll give you a little bit of time to talk about that with your table buddy, and then we'll share. I try to not talk like a 9, but it's okay.
Oh, okay, got it. But his tracking hours when I do that probably help them on the side before class or after class to work to get into the report schedule.
I think I would also start collecting evidence pieces, so maybe different types of assessments, collecting evidence of their progress and their reading, so that maybe at some point we can get to the stage where
You just take a seat.
they can either decide if they need an IEP, what should be included in their IEP. It seems like, yeah. Sorry. Hers and I was in the table isn't here yet, so.
sounds like it's wrapping up.
No.
There you go.
Okay, so did anybody have scenario number 1? Can somebody read that out loud for us?
In the first few weeks of school, you notice one of your 4th grade students is having trouble reading. He is adding words to the text that are not actually there and mispronouncing sight words such as the. What do you do?
So what would be your solution? How would you gather and then apply that data to fix that situation?
I would say you probably gathered the data through running record, maybe, and then some of the activities we thought about doing is I know, like just going, like highlighting those sight words within text or whatever it may be. Like I remember observing on my class, she like had the newspaper out, 'cause there's so many sight words in there, and just having them highlight those and just making sure they're paying attention to those. And then Kyle had a pretty good idea.
Yeah, kind of same thing with she is. Well, I'm not primary, I'm secondary, so it's kind of hard to be in the situation. But a suggestion that I could have, or that I might do if I was primary, what I would have, like the partner, I'd probably just do with the newspaper and have them underline all the sight words and highlight them stuff, and then read out loud to a partner, and the partner mispronounces something or like adds in a word like the student was, they could like in a different color mark it on their sheet, and then after they're done talking, they could like talk about it and like, well, why did you add this word? Like, and then just talk about like their differences and how they viewed the reading and actually read it.
Good. Yeah.
And all of these scenarios we've experienced throughout the last couple months of our first years. And we have 6 scenarios, but obviously there's only 3 groups, so if you want to read them on your own on the board, feel free. But we'll move to, did anyone have 2 or 3? 4? Yeah. Alright, so you'll go next.
One of your above average students is performing well, but still asks questions throughout each lesson, showing that she is challenged. However, their mom insists that her daughter is regressing and isn't challenged at all. Oh, and conferences are next week. What do you do? And so we said that like with you keeping data and keeping track of students' progress, like you'll have that evidence that, you know, she has been improving and she still is improving, but she is also still being challenged. So.
Thank you.
And number 5, is maybe number 5. And number 6. Okay.
During the very first week of school, you notice a student is unable to spell basic words. This student is in your 4th grade class but has trouble spelling, speaking, and is at a kindergarten level in reading. What would you do?
We kind of talked about, at this point, you need to start collecting evidence. Just maybe in my school, we might do a check-in, check-out sheet where the teacher is monitoring what they do and then make notes at the end of the class period, sign off, and then you have that evidence over time so you can look back and maybe start to form an IEP and figure out what accommodations they need in your classroom.
Thank you. So using that one, I have that student in my class, and so this is an example of the beginning intervention form that I had to fill out based on him to get him brought up for like some sort of special ed and get an IEP figured out for him. So basically what I had to do, I'm sorry, it's a little blurry, I needed to figure out what area of needs he had and what target areas we were working on. So it was like reading, writing, reading, I know it's kind of spread out. And then this one specifically, he was an ELL student, so he got pulled out for 20 minutes a day. 10 minutes of those were just working on sight words because, like I said, he couldn't spell I, like I went to the store, B-A-Y, which makes sense with the ELL background. And so you're just recording what you're doing, how often you're doing it, for how long, and that way when we're getting brought up, so you have evidence of what you've been doing, what you've been trying, and then we can go to the next one. And this, she actually got yesterday because we're going to have a meeting for him to get some sort of IEP going, and so they want me to fill out this entire thing. So like I said, this was, I found out within the first week, so right when you find out that there's a student that's really low or really high, just make copies of their work, that way you can still send it home, and that way their parents can still see it, but then you have that information recorded. And then also, he has accommodated assessment, so I will have him take the assessment on his own, see what he gets, make a copy of that, and then I'll redo it with him, so that way he's not failing and he's still, because he gets very frustrated, he can barely read, so he'll just kind of do whatever. That way you have a copy of what he initially did, and then a copy of what you did with him with those accommodations. And then that's just the other side of that sheet that I need to fill out for that meeting to get some sort of IEP or interventions going.
Okay, so one of the scenarios that was not passed off what we had. Basically, was you have students and you're having trouble keeping track of their strengths and weaknesses in writing and reading. So at my school, something that we do is we actually take anecdotal notes on our students. So each student has like a page on a Google Doc, and every day like the entries are dated, and then we talk about like what they're doing and like what they need to improve on. So it's a really good way to keep track of data, like what your students need to work on, and then when you have a conference with them the next day, it's kind of like you can pick up where you left off. Okay, yesterday we were working on capitalization, how are you doing today? And it's a good way to monitor their progress throughout reading and writing for the entire year. Another scenario that we had that we were not able to read was something that I work on in my school is when students read and write, especially in reading. We talk about how readers ask good questions, and so part of that is clarifying and predicting and questioning and summarizing. And so a good way to keep track of that kind of data rather than just listening to them and saying, okay, you really clarified today, good job. But actually having a double journal entry. So currently we're working on a literature study. A group of students get a book and then they read and discuss. But instead of just discussing, they have a double journal entry where they take a quote from the text that helps them practice writing dialogue, with dialogue tags and punctuation. And then they have to explain their thinking. So they have to predict or clarify about that text. So Johnny ate an apple. Wow, I wonder what he was thinking. That apple was probably really delicious. I predict that next time he will do this. Okay, so it's a really good way for the kids to keep track of themselves and for me to keep track of what they're doing, and then again, taking anecdotal notes from what they're able to do. Okay, so Alicia and I both have standardized district assessments that we have to give, just like most schools. My school uses MAP. So this is an example of some MAP data that was kept. All the data is kept online, and then you run the reports online. So it's English, math, and reading. English is like language uses, grammar, that kind of stuff. So this is actually just one student in particular. All of her different scores for each 3 tests. You can run the reports in different ways. So I run this in an individual way where I can see actually, her individual score. So if you look over here, red would be that she is below her warning. Blue would be exceeding. So wherever the black dot is, that's where she would be. So we see that at the beginning of the year in the fall in English, she is warning or below, but we do see in math that she would be exceeding. So it's a good way to keep track of data and then set student goals based on that. So if your student is below or warning in reading, then that's a good way to decide, okay, what do I have to do to get that student to meeting or exceeding? And then if you go to the next slide. You can actually see it as a bar graph, and online, when you run the reports, you can see specifically what they need to work on. So there's a list of like what they can do, it's proficiency. So you can kind of check off, okay, they're really good at grammar, but they're having trouble with comprehension with nonfiction text. And then that would tell you, okay, in literature study or in guided reading groups, that's really what we're going to be focusing on with that student is their comprehension. And then you have to think about a way, okay, how am I going to track that? So my next course.
And then I do not use MAP or anything, but my district also has, it's called Connect Ed. And depending on what district you're either currently in or will be in, you'll have some sort of, most likely, way to gather data. So this is what I have. This is just where all of my students' names and IDs were, which is why I cut it off. But then it shows each standard and if they're in mastery, remediation, or near mastery. And then if you hover over those, it would say, 16 out of 20. And then the percentage, and then also if you hover over the exact standard, it would tell you exactly what it is. And then also you have the assessments. So these are our PBA's performance-based assessments, the first one, second one, and then at the bottom you can see the class average, and then also with each standard, how many of your students were mastery, how many were remediation, how many were near mastery. So if they're all lacking in one specific standard, you're like, oh, well, I must not have taught that very well, and then go back and really hit that skill hard or teach it in a different way. Do more engaging activities. And then this was another sheet that I can access through Mastery Connect, and it shows each question and how many students answered it correctly, how many answered D, which was not right, depending on the question. And so occasionally I'll bring this up after the assessment, and then we'll all look at it. It's like, okay, well, we all struggled on number 6, so let's look at that one again. Why we think A was the answer, and why D is actually the answer, and reevaluate what was going on. And this was specifically for literacy. So they're kind of struggling with like inferences, so that was possibly an inferencing question, and then that also tells me that we need to practice that some more. And then this was something that's really nice. There's 6 teachers in 4th grade for me, so it shows how many students all of the 4th grade teachers have for mastery, near mastery, and remediation. Sorry. And then we have this really cool thing, it's called Power Half Hour, where we can look at the data and then based on, you know, let's say one of my cooperating teachers is really doing well with inferencing. So during a half hour every single day, all of my kids that are remediation with inferencing will go to their classroom and really focus on that specific skill. And if I'm doing well with vocab, then I'll take all the kids that need help with vocab. And it's just another form of intervention, and we can use this type of data and have background for why we're doing what we're doing.
Okay, and then Marissa and Kyle got the situation where it was actually one of my students. Definitely he was a little bit of a messy reader, misreading sight words. It didn't really change the meaning of the sentence, so he might have been adding had for have, but the tense makes a difference. So, and Marissa mentioned it, the way that you would collect data for something like that would be a running record. In my district, we have Fontes and Pinnell, so the texts are already given. So this area right here would actually be filled out with the words from the text as a student would read out loud. So they would read to me and I would be marking down, okay, what words, what if they have an error, and then you have to go back and you actually analyze, was it meaning, like did it change the meaning of the sentence, did it change the syntax, all that kind of stuff. And this data is really important to have and keep because again, you can monitor that progress all year to see if your student is moving up on their reading level, and it's also a good way to see, okay, if they're a struggling reader, what specifically are they struggling with? Is it comprehension? Is it sight words? I mean, what is it? And then after the student reads the text out loud, there's comprehension questions to go with that. So it's a really good way of monitoring what they need help with. And in my district, there's a short response. It's like we call it writing about reading. So they'll read a passage and then they have to write about it. And so that really helps us see as well. I know in my district specifically, our students have more trouble with writing than reading. So it's a really good way to see, okay, they might be comprehending it, but it's very hard for them to put into words. And then as you keep this over the year, you can see progress. And again, it just specifically shows what that student needs to work on. And just something really, really quick. Carly mentioned check in, check out, and it's really important to collect data academically, but also to collect academic for behavioral things as well. I have a student that I just put in check in, check out. Basically what the system is the student will be given a teacher mentor and they get a piece of paper, and in each subject of the day they can score 2 points if they're like respecting themselves and the rights of others in their area, and then they get those points throughout the day. And it's a really good incentive to keep them on track for their behavior. So not just keeping track of academic data, which I think is what we usually think about when we think about data, but behavior data too, so that if you need to send a student to a program like check in, check out, or an after school program, something like that, you have the data at a meeting to say, okay, here's what's been going on since August to December. This is why I think that the student needs this program.
And another way to form or gather data on behaviors is I use Class Dojo. I don't know if you've heard of it or used it. But so every student makes their own profile and they can like create their little avatar and customize it, and it's like a little profile that they have. And let's say so-and-so is doing a great job working hard, then I can go give them feedback and give them, I'm not going to give them one because then they're like, oh, why am I getting points on a Saturday? But, and then if they need work, then you add or take away a point with needing work, and then you can actually look at their overall report. And this is, so you can select whether you want it today, the week, last 2 weeks, all awards. So you can see, okay, well overall, they're getting the most points taken away being disrespectful, and they're getting the most points by working hard. And then you can actually look at the whole thing for your specific class. So I can go to my class report and then also look at all awards and say, okay, most of my class is doing a really great job with working hard. And then they're talking out of turn a lot. So, okay, what can I do to combat the chattiness of my class? So it's, again, a really nice tool, and then you can actually create groups. So these are my like reading groups. So if all of my brain busters did a really great job and were participating, asking great questions, I can give all of those students in that specific group points or take away points if they were not meeting what I know that their potential is. Any questions about either academic data or behavioral data? Oops, sorry.
It's just important to remember, like, to be collecting your data from the very beginning, because if you start in the middle of the year, it becomes a lot harder, and you're gonna make it a lot easier on yourself if you have like data from day one. I know I have a data binder, so I've got like their running records, I've got their behavior stuff, and it's all in just one big binder, and each student has a tab, so when I need something, I just go to that tab and say, oh, okay, Johnny was doing this, like, here's my data on that, so I can show a team or another team member if I need something on that student.
Yeah, and then also, like Jenna said, just start from the very beginning. I know I had like student portfolios, so all of their work would go in there, but then I had parents be like, oh, well, I don't know how my kid is doing, they're not bringing anything home, which is when I started making copies of the things that they do exceptionally well on, or really like above or below normal. So making copies, that way you have it, and then you could also send it home so the parents and families know how that student is doing. Okay, well, thank you all for coming, and if you're going to the other presentations, enjoy those.